It is 1 o'clock in London, and we're really happy to see so many people joining today, and we're particularly grateful to have been able to assemble in the middle of August this really fantastic panel of experts around the question of what are the implications of changing a name. So this is part of our webinar series, which we do every Wednesday, and we're going to keep doing them also through the month of August. Despite people being on holidays, we kind of felt it was really good for those who kind of do feel like half an hour of engagement with the business school to come together. So also in the next couple of weeks, we will have webinars as usual, but they will be the short ones for just half an hour. And we have a great webinar next week about the economic impact of COVID-19 in emerging economies. And then on the 26th of August, we have a webinar about I will pronounce it bullshit in business, which happens to be one of the areas of expertise of my colleague, Andre Spicer. So my name is Professor Caroline Wiels. I'm a marketing professor at the business school, formerly known as CAS. As you can imagine, the announcement that the business school is dropping the name CAS, which is now a bit over a month ago, provoked very strong reactions among our community. This made us realize that names are probably something we don't really think about very often until we have to, right? So we kind of take them for granted. But then when something like this happens, we suddenly start thinking about them. And what has become clear to me and to Andre over the last couple of weeks is that we seem to be thinking about very different things when we think of what our name actually means to us, whether that's our own personal name or the name of an institution, or another beloved brand, for example, out there. So for example, some of our alumni and students think mostly about the brand when they think of the name of the business school. And what they worry about, understandably, is when we change our name, is this actually going to affect the value of this brand? And in turn, is it going to affect their own value in the job market? In addition, many of us, in particular staff members probably, also have an identity investment in CAS, right? So we are kind of known for We Are CAS. It's a campaign that we've run really successfully over many years. And even though the staff, in particular of the business school, overwhelmingly supports the name change, many of us still feel a kind of grief at the thought of losing this CAS identity. And this is also true for a lot of students and alumni who really kind of believe into what the business school is doing, and the name is associated to that. But then there are also, of course, those for whom, now that we know the history of John Cass, the thought of working and studying at an institution that is named after someone who's made their wealth from the exploitation of human beings, which might actually be their ancestors, has become really unbearable. So you have all these different views, and however you turn this situation, it's a complicated one that needs really careful thinking and careful handling. And we kind of thought, when we started looking into this, that what we kind of realized is that changing names actually happens a lot. It's a very common phenomenon, so much so that there is a whole research area around name changes that is considered from all these different interdisciplinary angles. And while I think it is important to understand the emotional complexities of this, it is also important to think of the opportunities that this brings. So changing a name brings with it all kinds of exciting opportunities to do things differently and to maybe go forward slightly differently as an institution and build a better school. So we're really, really lucky to have this wonderful panel of experts joining us today to tease out some of these complexities. And I will hand over to Andre in a second to introduce our panel. However, what I do want to remind you is that while, obviously this has all been prompted by our own name change, which is impending, what we've asked them to do is talk about this general issue of changing names from their particular research focus and research perspective, rather than talking about our situation, even though certainly your questions and the discussion might bring it back to that. So as usual with these webinars, please use the Q&A function to ask questions, and Andre and I will moderate these and pass them to the participants. And I'm now going to hand over to Andre to introduce our panel. Thank you.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's excellent to have so many people with us in the summer and such an amazing panel of people. When Caroline and I began to look into this, we realized that there was this whole cross-disciplinary tradition of research looking at name changes, and we wanted to bring together people who talked about name changes in cities, such as Derek, people who looked at personal name changes, such as Corrado and Simon, people who looked at organisational name changes, such as Marianne, and also people who looked at branding name changes, such as Marius. So we've got some of the world leaders in this field with us today from really different disciplines who often don't speak with each other. So this is a really unique event. So let me just briefly introduce the guests we have today, and then I'll begin with our first speaker. So Derek Alderman is a professor and head of department of geography at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He's the Betty Lynn Hendrickson Professor of Social Science there as well. He's a cultural geographer and historical geographer, and he looks at name places, naming studies, and looking at cultural struggles around naming and renaming of public spaces. It's an important lens for understanding the unresolved place of race, memory, and identity in America. Professor Alderman is going to look at the issue of cultural and historical implications of changing a name. Then we have Marianne Glenn. She's the Joseph F. Cotter Professor of Management and a Professor of Sociology at the Carroll School of Management, Boston College. She's also the Director of Research at the Winston Center for Leadership and Ethics. Her research interests are at the intersection of micro-process level cognitive processes and cultural influences on identity, symbolism, and interorganizational leadership. And a personal note, Marianne's work has been quite inspirational to me over the years, and particularly a really interesting paper she wrote many years ago about the history of organizational names in America. She's going to look at organizational implications of changing a name. Then we leave into our sort of local boy, I guess, Marius Ludica. He's an associate professor and reader at the business school, formerly known as CAS. His research explores brands and contemporary consumerism with regards to cultural moralism, social conflict, and acculturation. Marius is the only person I know who studied people obsessed with Hummers, the big trucks. So Marius is going to look at the branding implications of a name change. Then we've got Corrado Giulietti. He's professor and head of economics at the School of Economics, Social and Political Sciences at the University of Southampton. And he's an applied economist. He works in the fields of labor economics and development economics with a particular interest in migration issues. So he's got a great paper looking at what happens when you migrate and change your name. He's going to look at the economic implications of changing a name, particularly personal names. And then finally, we have Simon Duncan. He's an emeritus professor of comparative social policy at the University of Bradford. He's an assistant director. He was an assistant director of the LSE Gender Institute and chair of the network Gender Inequality and European Regions. His current interests are family, relationships, and personal life. Research projects have examined living apart together, weddings, and marital name change. So that's what brought us to Simon. He's done some great work on changing marital names. Professor Duncan's going to look at individual implications of changing a name. So now you've seen this rich embarrassment of riches, intellectual riches we have before us. Let's pass over to Derek to hear about the issues of changing names in cities and spaces.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm just going to take a moment here and share. Okay, just got to make sure everything works. I've done Zoom quite a bit, but I always remain very suspicious of the technology. So please bear with me. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending, and I thank the organizers for inviting me. This is quite an honor. Wish I could be there in person, but this isn't bad either. I do want to make a note about my voice, and this is not where I apologize for my Southern accent, although some people think I should. I do want to make very clear my positionality in some of these discussions, which is as a Southern male from the Southeastern United States, and the Southeastern United States has a highly charged racial history. It's impossible for me to fully understand and speak to the experiences of living with and against white supremacy and racism. And so as I try to talk about some of my work with the politics of naming and renaming within the United States and the racial politics of those struggles, I don't want there to be any sort of uncertainty or confusion that I'm not trying to speak for those marginalized communities of color, but in fact, I speak in solidarity. I'd like to begin my remarks by hopefully on a rather positive note, in the sense that I have always tended to see my work on the renaming process, particularly from the standpoint of those communities that are engaged in it. And those communities range from local governments to highly marginalized communities that really don't have a seat at the table. That it's a creative intervention. That often we see renaming, particularly for those who are not supportive of it, as a sort of tearing down of what once was there. But I would like to encourage us to see it as a creative moment. And it's also an intervention in the sense that it's an attempt to make a change, to destabilize, to alter the way that we have traditionally done things, with the idea of hopefully leading to something better into the future. As we think about this issue of renaming, which in my case, I've done a lot of work on the renaming of streets, the renaming of schools, in the sense of, K through 12 and even some higher education context. I think it's important to sort of really outline the full stakes of what is at play. That it is a major restructuring of public symbols. And when we talk about public symbols, I want to emphasize the publicness of it, in the sense that while the name of a school may seem to be something that belongs to a particular school, the name of any school, the name of any street, the name of any town, city, is part of a larger geography of public symbols that we all have a vested stake in, we all have an interest in. And I really want to get across the idea that if we look at the way we have traditionally laid out symbols, especially here in the United States, but it probably also applies to where you folks are in the UK, there has been sort of a defining of who really matters as a member of the public, who belongs within sort of the way we recognize the public through our symbols. And so renaming is an opportunity to make an intervention in that storytelling about who matters within the world. I'd also like to suggest to you that when we engage in renaming, we're also engaging in what I've been sort of writing about for quite a while, which is a form of commemorative activism, that we're making an active intervention in how we remember and connect to the past. I don't see names, place names, school names, street names as sort of just historical markers. They're public memorials. They're extensions of the process and the politics of remembering the past. And in the case of renaming, it's a chance to challenge the hegemony of white supremacy. It's a chance to challenge the sort of taken for granted position of power that certain white supremacists and their historical social influence has had on the landscape and had in the way we identify ourselves. And in particular, I would suggest to you that these name struggles are often about what my colleague in sociology, Gary Fine, discusses as the reputational politics of remembering the past. How do we remember major historical reputations? And when you affix a person's name to a place, it is a major effort to enhance and to fix the legitimacy of that person's reputation. And by the same token, when you rename, you are creating a situation in which you can actively debate, question, and maybe even change sort of the way we identify and connect with that reputation. And so as much as names serve so many different roles, from the very practical to the very philosophical, I don't think we can really lose track of the fact that names seem to be rather simple memorials, but they're highly contested, and they can be quite important to the work of how nations imagine themselves, how communities, how institutions imagine themselves. And then, you know, I'm a cultural geographer. And so I'm always thinking about place, and I'm always thinking about how do names contribute to the making of place from a socially constructed perspective. And so I would suggest, and I've been writing about for now a few years, about how names have a materiality, and how, in fact, rather than just seeing a name as a symbol, or seeing it just simply as a memorial, or just simply seeing it as a story that's communicated to the public, that names are highly grounded within our material experiences. We see them everywhere. They're incorporated into many of our texts and many of our performances, many of our movements and our sensory experiences. And in fact, when you rename, you are in effect destabilizing the relationship. And I think in a positive way, by the way. I think sometimes destabilizing can be a very positive creative force. You are destabilizing what has historically existed as a very discriminatory built environment. And so when we think about discriminatory built environments, it's important to realize is that names can affect people. In fact, I have worked with a lot of communities in the United States who have told me, and I'm, again, not trying to speak for them, that they are affected by the names of racist historical figures that they see on their courthouse lawns or on their streets or on their public schools. And they are affected negatively by it. And we have to always be aware of the fact that these names are very complex pieces of infrastructure that don't just have one single meaning. They actually can affect people in an assortment of different ways. It's part of what makes it so controversial. But we have to be aware of, particularly in this political moment, that we need to create built environments that are not just safe, but they're places of respite, that they actually can be places of reaffirming people. And then finally, the idea being that as much as names are parts of the past and the historical lessons, they are always about the future. That one of the whole reasons that people name places the way they do is they're trying to project certain values and ideas into the future, to live beyond the creators of the name. And I think it's important to realize that there's high stakes to the renaming project, because it is very much about what do we want our future to look like in terms of values inscribed into the landscape. I do, and I have a tendency, and it's very hard to relate humor here because we're on Zoom. In fact, I think Zoom is a humorless technology. But I've been accused of being bossy, and maybe that's sort of part of my Southern upbringing. But I do want to leave the group, and maybe this can open up in terms of questions for later, to think about that what do we do with this creative intervention? What do we do with this creative moment? And how do we move the discussion and the practice beyond simply just the removal of a name? And how do we actually move beyond what I've sort of called airbrush politics, this idea of sort of making changes and then just moving on? And I think one of the ways that we can think about this is there's been quite a few scholars, a very good colleague of mine, Karen Till, out of Ireland, a lot of folks here in the United States that have talked about that these name changes need to be made part of a larger process of memory work. That in fact, they need to be part of the labor of actually coming to terms and reckoning with the histories of racism, the histories of slavery. And I think in the case of a business school, it's a perfect place for coming to grips and reckoning with the political economy of racism and racial capitalism. I think you want that to be what's guiding a renaming struggle, rather than it simply being a matter of sort of doing what we call public relations work. At least that's what we call it here in the United States, which is where you're making changes, you're trying to make people feel better, but you don't really go any deeper than just really a name change. And in fact, one of the things that I think is absolutely needed, and I don't want to get too bogged down into sort of theory, because that's not really my specialty, frankly, is that I think we should see naming and renaming as part of a larger assemblage. In other words, it's connected to various different practices, discourses, places, social actors. And what we want to do is connect that renaming to a larger array of strategies for linking with other anti-racist work and other forms of anti-racist teaching. And I would encourage the group to take a look at Furman University in the United States, which has a massive study that they've conducted called Seeking Abraham, Abraham being the name of an enslaved gentleman who worked at that university campus when in the days of enslavement. And it basically talks about how Furman University, and it's carried out a renaming of buildings on campus, but it's connected that renaming with providing financial support for marginalized groups. It's about bringing about larger social justice in the community. It's about building other memorials. It's about having very sort of uncomfortable discussions on campus about how much slavery, in the case of the South in the US, is foundational to our very institutions. I also think that the renaming project is incomplete, it's unfinished civil rights work if we don't think of it in a reparative way. And one of the things that one of my colleagues, former student Jordan Brasher, and I have argued in a number of pieces now, is that we need to, in the moment of renaming, we need to also think almost instantly about what are we going to replace that former name with? What kind of spaces are we going to create, not just to create a comforting sort of generic name or image or something that's not controversial. We need to be more concerned with actually how do we try to memorialize the Black histories and names and lives that have been really excluded and written out of much of the way we see our places and our institutions. And I don't want to speak for your particular college or university, but I do want to say that in the United States, what we find is that universities are highly wounded places. We do embrace diversity and inclusion, but we are still carrying out the work of white supremacy to a large degree. We still make the lives of Black people invisible. And we, in fact, need to not just remove racist offensive names, but we also need to engage in the reparative work of remembering those who are often forgotten. And then the final thing I want to say is that building off of some really great work by a colleague of mine at Oklahoma State, Rebecca Sheehan, is that I would want to encourage us to think of this as a regenerative moment. I want us to think about the idea that as much as names, and particularly names that have a long history, are comforting and preserve them and we take pride in them, and there's nothing wrong with that, we need to always recognize and balance that with the I think the important objective of treating the name landscape, the memorial landscape, as a dynamic participatory process, that we constantly need to be thinking about it as an organism, that we're constantly trying to keep that organism healthy. We're trying to have that organism actually reflect the social, cultural changes, the changes in values, the project of social justice. And so I've tried to encapsulate a whole lot of ideas in a very short period of time, but I wanted to leave you with those thoughts. And again, thank everybody for having me.
Thanks, Derek, for that whistle-stop tour and some fantastic material. I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to keep going without some more questions because we're already running a little bit short on time. So I'll hand over to Marianne Glenn now, a professor in the organisation area, and she's going to talk about the organisational implications of naming. Before you begin, Marianne, I just want to say people can add their comments and questions into the Q&A, and we'll hopefully have around about half an hour to begin to draw some threads together when we get to the end. So please, Marianne.
Thank you. Let me just boot up. Okay, is this showing okay? Hello?
Yes, I can see it fine.
Okay, thanks. Derek, that was terrific. I really enjoyed your talk, and I think you'll see that there's some resonant threads in what I'm going to talk about too, but I'm coming at it from the space of organizations or firms when I look at it, and probably in a more pragmatic way, as we tend to do in the business school. I tend to think of names as symbolic identity markers that tell you what an organization is all about. It's a statement of who we are and what we do. And in the organization theory literature, the study of organizational identities started in the mid-1980s with a very influential paper by Alderman and Wetton. And they, borrowing from psychology, they conceived of organizational identity as the encapsulation of those attributes that are central, distinctive, and enduring for an organization. And what triggered their thought on this was what they had noticed happening at the University of Illinois. This is not a name change, but it's an identity change. They noticed that in the 1980s, the University of Illinois had a relatively minor budgetary change, but the reactions of administrators and faculty seemed to them to be over the top with a screaming to pain ratio, as they put it, out of proportion to the cut. What we observed was the anguishing personal and collective examination of members' taken for granted assumptions about what was core, enduring, and distinctive about an American research university in general and the University of Illinois in particular, exacerbated by the terrifying prospect that the slightest reduction in the current organizational configuration could precipitate an uncontrollable erosion of organizational and by inference personal identity. So it was a pretty serious thing that happened to people, although it seemed to be triggered by a relatively small change. And they concluded that it was a symbolism attached to the budget cuts that was threatening. And that's the focus of much of the work on identity, that it's a significant symbol, but it's also very strategic. It serves as a reputational signal, as you were saying, Derek. In this case, more specifically for internal constituencies and external audience. It tells you what a place is and what its standing is in that. So it positions the organization strategically. It's also a touchstone for understanding, legitimation, and evaluation, so that once an organization is legitimated, often by the use of a particular kind of name, it can help its survival and its financial performance. I've been doing work on names and especially name changes for some time now, and I'm going to draw from some of those things. And if you'll forgive me, I will hit you with some regressions and things like that, but we'll just talk through them, okay? They will be a backdrop. So first thing we did was we looked at the historical patterns in organizations over time. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that organizations started off in colonial times with very descriptive and long names. The first one we could identify was a long wharf in the town of Boston in New England. Very specific, very unambiguous, and very long. And over time that evolved to something much shorter and much more ambiguous. And what was interesting about it is that names exhibited what we call a periodicity. That is, during different periods of time, they all seem to converge to change and to focus on a particular kind of a name structure. It might be like a personal name with a first, middle, and last name, although in more recent times, naming has gotten especially abstract and nonspecific. So keeping that in mind, we began to look at organizational names that changed according to some of these criteria, which had to do with the length of the name, its ambiguity, that is, the sense to which it uses fabricated or made up kinds of words, and specificity. To what extent does it describe what happens? And this is what we found. As organizations change their name, they tended to distance themselves from their old name. And so you can see with the line of old name attributes, there are negative weights on the values there, showing that it's different from, they're leaving behind something. But at the same time, there's a positive relationship to the institutional prevalence of an attribute, a new name. That is, they try to look like other organizations in their field. And that becomes very important to them because it has implications for legitimacy and other things. So the reason that such conformity to the prevailing industry or organizational field norms is important is because isomorphism legitimates. And one marker of legitimacy is the comprehensibility of a name. Do people understand what it is, basically, when they see the name? And although there are main effects for different name characteristics, what really interested us was the bottom half that shows that conformity in ambiguity and specificity was strongly related to legitimacy of a name. That is, when organizations model themselves over similar, when organizations model themselves over similar others in choosing a new name, they tend to be seen as more legitimate. And the importance of legitimacy is that it tends to drive survival, and also it can enable wealth creation in organizations. The other interesting thing we happened on that I thought could interest this group a little bit is that when we looked at trends in name configuration and the extent to which they might reference something else like geography, the market, or a person, you find that the references to a person's name declines rather dramatically over time. So there's less and less of it. We can speculate for all kinds of reasons that in the early days, the founding was often raised to the founder, mostly himself, as to what that was. Over time, it became more abstract, the firm changed, and they got away from it. At the same time, the general sense of a name is fairly enduring and serves an organizational well. Think of the Ford Motor Company. It still works in spite of all the changes that have gone on. So my thoughts are these. What names and changing names means that their identity markers, and there needs to be this resonance with internal and external constituents because they serve as a basis for legitimacy, which is a really important organizational attribute. Why it's important to sometimes change a name? Because alignment with institutional norms is important. In other work, we studied organizations that appended .com to their names in the late 1990s. The first one of these was egghead.com. And we looked at them to see what happened to them by 2003. And only 12% still traded above $1 a share, meaning that they kind of went bust for the most part. So at one moment in time in the late 1990s, there might have been a good alignment between what the organization name was and the prevailing norms, but over time there was a shift in the meaning of those norms. And so organizations that still had a toehold in the old order were at risk in the new. And something like that may be afoot with these historical changes that we're seeing as norms shift dramatically about them. And finally, what are the challenges and the opportunities? I think the challenges lie in the management of the name change itself. That is I mentioned at the onset, there was a screaming to pain ratio with this kind of identity change that took place. And Caroline has already alluded to the emotional aspects of it. It's very real and very important. There's also this notion that we talk about of optimal distinctiveness in the choice of a new name, that a new name should be similar enough to important others in the field, but different enough that it stands out. And so that should also be consistent with the times, whatever's happening, as I just illustrated with the case of the .com names. And the opportunities are, it's a sense to avoid illegitimacy. So as you move away from names that could connote racial unrest, or a devaluation of persons, it's an opportunity to revitalize and update an organization in important ways. And that is it. So thank you very much, and I'll end it there.
Thanks so much for this, again, fantastic tour of a whole range of research and a whole range of sort of insights into how organizational names change, Marianne. A wonderful piece that builds wonderfully on Derek. So I'll say again that if anyone has any comments, please put them in the Q&A or chat function as we go, and then we'll draw threads together when we get to the end. So I'll pass over to Marius now, who's going to talk to us about brands, some of the names we spend the most time in organizations thinking about.
Yes, thank you, Andre. Good afternoon, everyone, here from Münster, Germany right now, where I'm on holidays in my parents' home. Thank you for joining, thank you for having me, and for giving me the opportunity for sharing kind of a CAS Insight perspective to all of you. Thank you also for Derek and Marianne for these fantastic starting points, or basically these fantastic elaborations on aspects on what I would try to integrate now, or basically bring together from a branding perspective. So my first point is just to make sure that those who are not in business schools or not basically have studied marketing in the past, to make sure that the understanding of what a brand is basically is updated, or that we can sync it together. And you will see that the elements of Derek and Marianne fit very well into that scheme of what is now understood to be a brand. So from the perspective as we teach at CAS, you would have basically three core elements of what are parts of the brand, and that's important for changing the name after all. So when we begin with the manifestations, which is often not really seen as an element of brands, usually the brand name or the logo. When you talk to a branding agency, that's what they normally consider. For us, the realm in which a brand exists, which is the brand manifestation, is everything you can touch and see, basically. So the building is part of it, the pencils, the lectures, the slides, the locations, the people even are part of the manifest environment that for consumers or for students, for stakeholders, are part of what a brand is. So that's basically experience in the manifest world, and as such closest to what Derek studies in terms of places and manifest reminders of the past, or political linkages. Brand culture is the second, which is also a more intangible element, is where the brand comes to life through behaviors, through certain types of speech, of ways of doing and saying things, but also the values of the institution, which are very often not as tangible, but they are then manifest in how a brand behaves and offers their services. And a third dimension would be basically allocated in thoughts of consumers or of stakeholder students, where they have built associations with a brand over time, where they have their own feelings and experiences that of course attach to a brand name over time. So that's where branding dimensions such as brand awareness and brand image come in, those classic measures of how many people know this brand name on the planet, what do they associate with it, is it favorable, is it strong, is it unique, etc. Classic branding dimensions. From a brand strategy perspective, what brand strategies would normally do is they would start with the core of the brand, which is very akin to what Marianne calls the symbolic identity. So this is the brand core, is basically what the brand does and why. There's a sense of purpose and a sense of focus and positioning within the market. And those elements, the thoughts that emerge in people's heads, the manifestations in the manifest world, and the culture, the brand culture in the social world, they all evolve basically around this core strategy. So for a brand manager, it's important to shape these elements really well, to understand them really well, especially in a market, let's say the academic market in the UK, with about 300 institutions and about 500,000 students that try to pick a university for their studies. It's important to get these elements well aligned and well together in order to be able to offer something of value to stakeholders. So when we speak of brand, we mean all these elements. We mean the manifest elements, which of course have massive implications when it comes to renaming, which means everything has to be relabeled and renamed and redesigned, which involves massive costs, of course. Involves the brand culture, which is more difficult to grasp and to capture, but it is also absolutely important in the exercise or the situation we're facing right now, because it's, as you will have seen, not very much about changing the name, but also very much about changing the culture, the behavior, the equality, the discussions behind it. And then, of course, the thoughts and feelings, associations that we're associating. So now from the stakeholder perspective, and that was mentioned already before, because we, in the same domain, it's not very surprising, we have that the building of relationships with brand names in those branded objects, which is something that we know consumers do in all sorts of ways. And from some research of the late 90s, we know that consumers do this in a very human way. So they would build a relationship with a brand, such as a friendship relationship. Sometimes it's an enemy relationship. Sometimes it's a secret love affair. There are all sorts of ways in which we build relationships to brands, and as such, of course, they are valuable. There are, as Marianne has said, there are identifiers, there are repositories of meanings, there are linkages to those experiences, but also, of course, to the reputation of a school. So something like a CAS brand name has in certain areas in London, in England, across the world, in some corners, a very, very good brand awareness, but also a very good brand image. And that's what students and our faculty and staff are, of course, proud of and fighting for when that would be abandoned. And yeah, over time, these relationships emerge, the attachment emerges, and therefore changing a name, as was previously discussed, is a very important exercise. So normally when brand strategists would change a brand name, the situation is very different from what we have now, because it might be because of a merger, it might be because there's a rebranding strategy going on, because the old meanings have lost resonance in a changed culture. But normally it's something that is triggered by a merging or by a merger situation. And therefore the considerations are probably a bit easier than they are in our situation. The second thing is a brand name becomes tainted because a university basically misbehaves, or a brand name misbehaves. There are some scandals attached to it. The brand name becomes unbearable for the action that have been done within the institution. So in the case that we're having now, for a business school brand name, the brand name has become tainted for very good reasons. So we know now, going back to that history of our namesake, that's a situation where nobody who's now actually working at CAS would proactively feel responsible for having make a massive mistake. But now, in the light of the culture change, this is something that comes to our mind, where we're becoming aware of something that is no longer possible to perpetuate. So the decision was made to change the name, and of course that makes perfect sense. Now, in terms of looking forward, when a brand name is changed, I'm very much on the same page with Derek to say that this is an opportunity for thinking about that core of the CAS brand, or of any brand name as it has been before, and then consider where should we go from here. So in other words, the surge on CAS name, I would say obviously, because nobody seemed to have cared very much about who Sir John Cass wasn't essential for building the CAS brand. It was it was basically almost an empty vessel that was filled with meanings by the school, by teachers, by staff, by students over time, by the CAS community, through the communication. So it was basically an empty vessel filled with meaning that have now become important and relevant in the market. Now, with the brand change name comes the opportunity of reconsidering what that brand should be, how it should be moved forward. What is it that a school or an organization stands for or wants to stand for in the future? And now we have so let's say a significant opportunity for adding depth to our brand name and depth to our brand itself. We have an opportunity for a collaborative process on shaping a brand name together with the community and discussing shared values and discussing what the school should be standing for. And that's, I think, is a fantastic opportunity, especially in an institution which is less hierarchically structured than a classic organization. It's something where we can have such collaborative exercises. And of course, what is very important, and that's my last point, It's very important because brand names are assets in student CVs. They are very expensive assets. And our students very often, with good reason, respond to say, you cannot just take that asset away from me. You cannot take that Harvard name, that Oxford name, that CAS name out of my CV because I've paid so much, invested so much in it. It is important to convey that a name change should and cannot destroy this kind of value, but there should be a strategic way of moving the brand name gradually from one state to the other, and building on the assets and building on the identity that the school already has. This is absolutely essential, I think, in a way where we have a situation where the brand name loss is felt as a loss of value, of identity, of basically everything that's important with the school, even though the services, the buildings, the professors have not changed, but just that particular signifier has changed. It's very, very important to make sure that this is a project for a positive change that will add value to the entire community, including the CVs and including those who work at the institution. So in that sense, I'm sharing that optimism and hope that we can embark in a journey that will add value to everybody and to our brand name as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Marius, for this branding perspective and the kind of advice you would normally give, and indeed you do give to companies who's sharing with us. So thank you very much. Let's move on and shift gear now from talking about collective names such as streets, cities, and organizations and brands to looking at individual names. So when I was looking at this, I came across a fantastic paper in economics by Corrado Giulietti and some colleagues. So I'll pass over to him to talk about what it means to change your individual name, which some people here may have done in the past, and many of our ancestors did. So I'll pass over to Corrado now.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you, Caroline, for the invitation. I was meant to share some slides, but I have some difficulties with the internet over here, so I'll try to make it, I'll try to read over the slide. Can I just confirm, can everybody see me and hear me well, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, okay. So the work that I carried out as part of my research agenda includes looking at the economics of names. And as we've discussed, as we've heard already from my colleagues, a name symbolizes, let's say, several traits of an individual, including identity, ethnicity, race, culture, religion, and sometimes origin. Economists look at this, let's say, pretty much under an economic viewpoint, and we look at how name actually provides a signal about the socioeconomic status of an individual. And a lot of the literature in economics has focused on the relationship between names and economic outcomes, for example, the ability of finding a job or the level of salaries. And they've done so, they've used, let's say, names as a tool to understand whether there exists racial discrimination. This has been a sort of popular literature in the past few years, which I have also contributed. Now, the research I would like to share today actually starts from the point not on whether discrimination is associated with the name that the individuals have, but on a more positive note, what can we do when actually individuals are discriminated because of their name? And I started thinking about a particular research question, which might come across like very strange nowadays, but it wasn't so about 100 years ago. And the type of research question that we were interested in is whether changing name could actually be a strategy to overcome discrimination in the labor market. And together with my colleague Costanza Biavaschi and Zara Siddiq, we started looking at this hypothesis in a particular context, which is New York City in 1930. This is quite a bit of time ago, yeah? However, it's a very important time for America and for the whole world. It's, the end of the age of mass migration. What we do in this research, we digitalize new data from a particular source of data, which is called Ancestry. Ancestry actually collects a lot of historical data. And in particular, a particular source that was appealing for us was the so-called naturalization papers. So you might be familiar on how, let's say, nowadays migrants can become naturalized when they move in a different country. You think about the US. The process of naturalization hasn't changed much over the years, but 100 years ago, individuals had to file papers at 2 points in time, when they declare that they want to naturalize, and after an average time of 5 years, when they actually petition the fact that they want to naturalize. Why is that important for us, for the migrants that we study in the United States? Because in both type of papers, they have to indicate their first and their last name. And when we look at this data, there was a striking fact. 30% of the migrants who naturalized in 1930 actually decide to change their name. Now, we call this process in a particular way, we call the Americanization of first name. It doesn't mean Americanization. It means that the great majority of these migrants who actually decide to change their name, they actually change name into one that is not just most, American sounding, but is most common among American people. I'll give some example in a second with the graph, but the striking aspect is not only that 30% of these migrants decide to change their name, but basically that the more American the name they change into, right, the higher was their observed occupational upgrade. I'll say it again. So when individuals change name into a more American names, they earn more money, they earn higher wages. This was a striking result that, we kind of found it very, very interesting. So for example, if an individual changed a name into John, which was the most popular American name at that time, they would earn something like 20% higher wages. If someone changed name into William or Joseph, they would have similar, let's say, occupational gains. These were very striking results for us, and it prompted discussion on why were these migrants, let's say, observed changing name and subsequently earning more money. Well, our research has highlighted that actually there was a strong bias, which I'm going to refer to discrimination. This is how economists refer to. Employers have strong preferences for American sounding names, and this constitutes a barrier for migrants, economic and subsequently, obviously, social integration. And this is something very important because we actually, not only we find the presence of this barrier, but our research highlights the existence of, and this is, I think is somewhat related to what my colleagues pointed out before, really the existence of a trade-off between maintaining something that is related to your individual identity, your name, right? And enhancing your labor market outcomes, right? So changing name is actually an effective strategy through which migrants can unleash economic success. They can do better in the labor market. And I think this is really the kind of main result that transpires from our research. Broadly speaking, I think, this is a particular period of time. So one has to keep in mind that this process that we observe in the labor market comes hand in hand with the bigger process of cultural assimilation. And so we can say that, for those migrants, especially who decided to change name, right, and they became more integrated in the labor market, right? So cultural assimilation was sort of instrumental to the process of economics assimilation. Now, if you think about the context of our research to the broader discussion that we have today, I think as society become more global, having foreign or distinctive names might become maybe less of an important issue. But our point, and I'm observing, let's say, name patterns from many countries, from China, from modern US, from countries in the Scandinavian countries, from Italy. Actually, if you have it foreign or distinctive names, there's still quite strong bias in the labor market. So this is an issue that is far from disappearing. But the question persists in the sense, as an individual, as a migrant who wants to become integrated, right? Would you be willing, for example, to give up your name in order to do better in the labor market, where these forms of discrimination still exist? And as I said, these forms of discriminations are much less salient than in the past, but they are far from disappearing. And I would like to leave the discussion open to this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Corrado, for this fantastic presentation, which is like a snapshot of a wider phenomenon in economics. So thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Simon Duncan for our final presentation, which is going to talk about the role of this individual name change, particularly around marriage, and the implications, surprisingly, that might have for a business school. So Simon.
Should we maybe take the opportunity and ask a few questions that we've had in the Q&A? And then Simon, whenever you can talk to us, just say something in the middle, it's fine, we'll figure it out. But if you're mute or unmute, unfortunately at the moment we can't hear you. The very first question that we had, and I suppose maybe that is directed at Derek, is by George, who I think is an alumnus, and he says, is there a point at which the use of a name by an institution transcends or becomes disconnected from the original individual that named it? So for example, today most people associate Yale with the university, and they don't think about the slave trader who actually endowed it. So should Yale or also Stanford be changing their names?
No, that's a very good question, and I probably don't have a perfect answer, but I will say that you have to draw a distinction between sort of historical heritage, which is our identification with specific people from the past and events from the past, from place heritage, which is our identification with those places that sort of develop their own power of memory and tradition that may actually be quite independent from the person that they reference. I would say that we have to be very careful though, because what may be someone's association that, well, I'm identifying with Yale and I don't think about slavery, we have to remember that the history of slavery and the history of racism is so deeply embedded in so many societies. Is it ever really possible to get past not knowing or thinking about or having to discuss those types of racial oppressive forces? But I think that's part of what makes the identification process and the renaming process difficult. But I think we have to recognize is that these places, these institutions have these histories. So it's not just that Yale means something to someone and it doesn't really reference slavery. Can you really talk about the institution of Yale without talking about the institution of slavery?
Thank you for that. Is there anybody else who would like to add something to this? Point? Because this is actually a question that we have gotten as well. So a lot of our students and alumni say, caste to me doesn't mean the person, but it means the institution, right? So we're in this very similar situation. So I think it is helpful to understand that by taking this view, you're also excluding other views. So I think there was a really valid question because a lot of our community have asked that.
Yeah, and Carolyn, I could also add very quickly that the fact that it becomes so embedded that we don't think about the connection to slavery or racism speaks to the power of the name.
Yeah. There was a very similar question from Jacob about whether or not the US should disassociate itself with George Washington. So I suppose in a way that is the same kind of question. So we already have an answer to that. Andre, would you like to pick another one?
Yeah, so Medhani, I think Guillaume, has an interesting question. What are the unintended consequences of renaming? Would renaming invisibilize the fundamental injustice past and present with the semblance of changing? So maybe we could take that in two parts, whether there's any unintended consequences of renaming. I don't know whether Marianne has any thoughts about that. And then this point about injustices of the past, maybe someone else would have some ideas about this.
Sure. The unintended consequences were kind of what I alluded to with the .com names, that if you become out of alignment, you could lose your legitimacy. That is, if you don't fit the category. And in some ways, CAS kind of fits the paradigm we were talking about. There's a disassociation from the old name attributes, but I know you now have a transitional name, City, University of London, which doesn't quite fit anything, if that's a name you're going to choose to use into the future. So you risk some legitimacy in doing that, in the sense that people won't understand it. And Andre, you probably know of Zuckerman's work with the illegitimacy discount, that if you can't fit something to the category to which it should belong, it tends to become devalued. So those kinds of things can come. The other problem, of course, is in the management of a name, particularly with internal stakeholders, in that people have vested interests in names, and different sets of stakeholders will probably advance their preferred new name. So that has to be managed very carefully, whether you use a bottom-up process or what. Primerica, when it used to be the United States Can Company, and when it was going to change its name, it said, oh, this is nothing. We'll put out a suggestion box and pick the best one and send somebody to Hawaii. And then they discovered it was a lot more complicated than that. So bring in the consultants, have it sounded out. It cost quite a bit of money. But in the end, they came up with something that was workable. So those are some of the things that are kind of unintended about it.
So, Andre, if it's okay, I'd like to address the justice issue. So one of the things that I've been a proponent of, and I'm not saying this simply to sort of advertise my perspective, but I really see this in a lot of cases in the US, is that we want to combine renaming with a larger sort of narrative, commemorative process and reflection process in which the institution talks openly about why it renamed, that it actually creates, in effect, sort of counter memorials to the idea that this institution once bore this name and that its change happened as a result of coming to terms with injustice. And so instead of the renaming being an erasure, which I'm not convinced it really is an erasure, you can't erase those kinds of massive histories, there's actually an attempt to build a greater infrastructure of symbolic identity narratives that can be helpful in understanding why the change had to happen.
If I could actually add something to that, because this is another question that has come up a lot, which is, aren't you just erasing history if you're changing the name? And I think it would be important to say on behalf of the school that we have no intention of doing that. So indeed, there has to be the work that Derek has described that goes with it, which is kind of like remembering work, to ensure that we remember that we were named Cass in the past and why we did change the name, and have a conversation about what the implications are for today's world that we live in, and the consequences that still exist for certain parts of our community in today's world, and what we can do in order to heal some of those and to move on from that. So that is really helpful, because indeed that's a question that has come up quite a lot. What I do want to, by the way, also, by the way, Simon, we still can't hear you. The suggestion has been made that that maybe restarting the computer might be the solution and joining us again, because it seems that your computer's microphone is off, because you are unmuted, but we cannot hear you still, unfortunately. And Mark has been trying to communicate with you through our WhatsApp group, so it might be worthwhile to have a look there. Also, a lot of you have been asking questions that are very specifically about us. So how will we conduct the name change process? What are the implications for employers? Will you be known on the job market? So these are really specific questions that I've tried to answer kind of like by typing answers from what we already know. And just to reiterate that there will be a lot more communications coming from the school, either at the end of this week or early next week, where we will address all of those questions. But with regards to the name finding process, there will be a really big consultation process in which we will include all of our stakeholders, so alumni, students, staff members will all be part of this process to find this new name together. and that will start in the new academic year. But we will, as I said, send much more information about that. Andre, do you want to pick another question in the meantime? We have one from Hari Jani, who asks, most countries which got independence from their colonial masters have changed the name of their country. However, in some cases, they got worse. Is there a much bigger issue here than just the name change? Who would like to speak to that?
So Caroline, I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but could you reiterate that question? I had a little bit of a cutout here in my feed.
Okay, so the question was about the fact that a lot of the countries that got independence from their colonial masters changed the name of their country, but in some cases they got worse. So I assume that the countries got worse or the names got worse. It's not quite clear. However, if you want to clarify that in the Q&A, please do so. But the question is really, is there a much bigger issue here than just the name change? And I suppose we have partly answered that already.
I mean, this is something I hear a lot in the United States, where there's a lot of debate about, well, should we be renaming when we have a host of social, economic inequalities to certainly deal with? And that's not ignoring that. I would probably suggest that that name issue is actually part of this larger sort of assembly of issues of injustice and inequality. So rather than being separate from them, it's actually part of. Now, I can't speak to those individual countries or their condition, but I mean, I'm just trying to give you the insight of what we hear in the US.
Thank you.
So there's a question from Lavina. It seems that naming should be based more on values. What does the university stand for, organizational stand for, rather than the big donor? Name and fame is such a big part of how we historically name universities, but the deeper question is, what are our values? So I wonder if we could, I could maybe address that to Marius, and then maybe it would be interesting to bring Corrado back in and think about individual values and this trade-off you face between, you know, remaining true to your national roots and also trying to get along in life.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely essential. It's a very important question and a very important point, because given that the brand name also may be speaking to the unintended consequences, the brand name is massively important, and losing a brand name, let's say a Yale brand name, which has a brand awareness across the globe, which is quite substantial, has a massive loss. So there's no doubt about that. Including eradicating a name like us completely is a massive problem. So, but there are different things. One is in the domain of offerings and services and products. There's a lot a school can do in terms of changing their curriculum, scrutinizing their own behaviors in terms of any sense of fairness and equality. So that's basically where the brand manifests. The more difficult part is where the brand lives through people and through discourse, through language, through forms of interaction, through career prospects, which is more in the cultural domain, which is of course certainly more important than the brand name. So the brand name comes as one change. So if a school conveys the sense of we're changing the name, period, that's certainly insufficient. So speaking to that question, absolutely, it would have to start with that question of what we do, why we do it, how we do it, and then scrutinize these particular elements of that CAS brand, and then seeing how from the inside out that would affect a name. And that also would help to define a new brand name, because that would mean what is it the institution stands for, what is it we do, and what we do not do, more importantly, what is it we don't do, to then formulate or basically develop a new label that encapsulates that sense of identity and sense of purpose.
So maybe I'll chip in, on the aspect of, this trade-off that we have between, if you want, identity and labor market outcomes. I think it's important in our case to go back to the sample of individuals we observe, which is super interesting. So these are migrants. Most of them come from European countries, say Germany, Italy, there was a period of rising nationalism. Probably you come to the US, you look at the American dream, a lot of these migrants wants to become American citizen. This is also a period where there were no welfare programs, right? So it was before the New Deal was introduced. So,
sorry, I'm just going to butt in for 2 seconds. Simon, can you speak?
Yes?
No.
Oh, okay. Should I carry on? Okay.
Yes, sorry.
No problem. So this is a period of time where, being part, of a new nation, we're looking at the sample of individuals who wants actually to become American citizens. So the type of trade-off that we're looking at, these are already individuals who wants to become part of a new nation, who wants to learn a new language and so on. Type of trade-off might be much different than other types of migrants who might want to come back. A lot of migrants actually during that period decided, my grandfather was one of them, decided to come back to Europe, right? And a lot of them did not want to give up that part of identity and changing name. So I found about 10 documents where my grandfather is listed, including the census and so on. And in 8 out of 10, his name, which is the same name of mine, is misspelled. And I never got to know my grandfather, but my relatives who are currently in the US, I've always asked, have you ever thought about changing name? Nowadays, I think it's much of a less of an issue because, as I said before, we become more global. There are more foreign names and so on, but the trade-off stays there. And so there's research showing very clearly that having distinctive names, which the more distinctive you might imagine, the more they embed particular, let's say, cultural values, sometimes of minorities, sometimes related to religions and so on. And the cost there can really be big. So I'm perfectly in when we talk about, sort of what are the trade-offs, what are the cost and benefits here. But if I can go back to just to give my little bit of perspective here about one point that was mentioned before, I think the important bit, and I think that I mentioned it before, it's the memory part, right? So this is, about changing name. It's part of a bigger process. And that memory of things that were there before shouldn't just be canceled. I don't think this is, a sort of process where anybody wants to cancel anything because I feel also on the sides of the business core currency, this is going to be your legacy. This is the way where you positive, let's say, make a change to make things better and highlight, the good things and the bad things. And I think you ought to do it in a transparent way. My view here is what is really difficult is to how you gather and you assemble the sort of preferences of many stakeholders. I can't imagine how many are going to be, honestly, because you discuss about alumni, but I feel, this is also part of London and there's so many stakeholders. So I appreciate that this is really, really difficult, but pretty much on what Andre and Caroline has said, I feel that this should really be seen as a positive intervention here. And I don't think there is an intention to cancel the past, but it's to use the past, let's say, to not commit the same mistakes in a way and highlight a positive way to change it as part, as Derek said, of this broader intervention. Okay, thank you.
And thank you so much for that. This kind of actually draws on another question that Sam asked in the Q&A function. He asked, beyond the change of a name, what is CAS doing, to actually address slavery issues and improve the chances of young people living in its neighborhood. Rightfully pointing out that while we are in the City of London, which is very affluent, Hackney Borough is right next to us, which is a borough with the highest concentration of Black people. I don't have all the answers because I cannot speak on behalf of obviously our Dean, but I can only say that there's a lot of work going on in the background and that we fully understand that the name change is not the end. If anything, it's the beginning. It's a symbolic action that is the beginning of a lot of work that we have to do. So we will share more information on that as we go along. There are actually quite a lot of questions coming in that are quite specifically about us. There are some people who feel that the reason why we announced the name change was because we were pressured by some very vocal people into it, and that those, I think there were some petitions going that those might not even be part of the business school community. I think the one thing that might be worthwhile to make clear, since we are on the record here, is that the staff of the business school overwhelmingly supports the name change. So it's just maybe important to say that it is not a decision that was forced upon us in any way, but it's a decision that the business school has taken proactively, and also after a consultation with members of staff, and it is what the business school wants to do. So maybe that's just important to note, that nobody has, like, we haven't been pressured into this, or this has been forced onto us in any way. And I think that does relate to another question that is asked by Oya, which again relates to cancel culture, which we also, with the discussion of erasing history, have heard a lot. So recently, cancel culture has been mentioned too often. Will changing names, renaming be a cure for it? I mean, we have a quite brutal history as a humankind. It has all been lived. Changing names and renaming will not change the history behind it. I believe it might be helpful for companies, but in a macro perspective, I don't think it will change things so much. What do you think? I think this might be an opportunity for Derek to maybe say again why it is actually so important that we address this issue of names, and how that is related to both our history but also to our future.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. I think I probably have spoken about and reiterated this point a few times. I think there's a danger here that we're in a real sort of unhealthy tension between saying that names are so important, and they certainly are. And my colleagues have done a fantastic job of really showing this to us. And then at the same moment saying that names can't do anything to help us. And we have to be very careful with that tension. And I do believe that, part of the movement that we see going on now is to address systemic racism. And so that racism is not confined to a single practice, a single person, a single place. It is absolutely envelops the totality of our society. I mean, that's in the United States what we're trying to come to terms with. And I assume my colleagues in other parts of the world are too. And if you address it in a systemic way, you've got to go to where that racism has inserted itself in even the most seemingly innocuous, seemingly sort of non-threatening places, to sort of excavate it. And again, I'm not suggesting it's an easy process, but it's not separate from addressing poverty. It's not separate from addressing discrimination. It's not, it in and of itself is not how you cure it, but you have to cure it systemically across the board. And it's one of those ways that we can think about it.
Thank you. Simon, are we going to try again? You're currently on mute.
If I'm still available.
Hallelujah. Yes, we still have 10 minutes, so maybe a very short presentation.
That's nice.
So we can...
I had to get my son in to do it for me.
Of course.
Anyway, here's this research I've been involved with together with Julia Carter at University of West England and Annelies Eilingsetter in Oslo University. And in Britain, as in many other countries, it seems expected and quite unremarkable for a woman to take her husband's name when she gets married. If we stand back from that tradition that we're in the middle of, it actually looks quite remarkable and quite unexpected. Here am I, I'm Simon Duncan. That's me, that's who I am. I can't imagine changing to some other name, but of course, that's not the perspective shared by the majority of married women in Britain. Just to give you some quick figures. 2016, 90% of married women in Britain have taken their husband's name. Even for the very youngest group, those between 18 and 30, it was 75%. In another 2016 survey, only, in inverted commas, 60% of women prefer to take their husband's name, which implies that about 20% took the husband's name more or less unwillingly. I was trying to look at some common themes with what used to be caste. I thought of three themes. The first, does it matter? Second theme is leakage. And the third theme is display. Let me go on to my next slide. Well, the first problem was, does this actually matter? Because current meanings and practices will be quite divorced from their historical origins. In Britain, women's names used to be quite important as part of the practice of curvature. There's a legal principle established in the medieval ages where a woman's property, her income, her children, and even her body became a property of her husband. And that was mostly abolished in the late 19th century. Though incidentally, marital rape continued, it wasn't recognized until 1991. But now is it just a charming tradition? A bit like the wedding cake, you know, everybody does it. It's part of a ritual, it's nice, but it's rather meaningless. And here's Adele and Abigail, enthusiastically looking forward to it. And look at Susan here. That perhaps gives us some ideas why it might matter. It meant a lot to her fiance, and she thought it was nice to make a gesture for some way to him. The first reason why it matters, what I call leakage of meaning. If you take symbols from the past and put them into current practice, you also smuggle in meanings from the past. And that means quite a bit to some men here. So Mandy's husband insists upon the marriage wouldn't mean anything, the wedding wouldn't mean anything without a name change. Derek wanted to have a name change to become part of a male club. And Rebecca gives the other side of the flip side of that. So for some men, they still employ that need to have a sort of authoritative presence, a male authoritative presence in the household. The majority of women who would prefer to take their husband's name, of course, they're still importing these meanings from the past. I presume, of course, that's why Cass wanted to change its name. But to be a good family, it's not just good enough to love and support your partner and your children and care for them and so on. Research in family studies has shown that you've actually got to show that to other people. And here's Ruth and Claire and Zoe. They're using a name change to show that they are a couple. That's Ruth, a proper couple. Claire, they're a proper family. The children all sharing the same name. Zoe, that you're committed if you change your name. And that's something I want to end up asking the business school. They've done the display. Is there the good family practice? Thank you very much for that rushed opportunity.
So I wonder if you could just briefly expand on that last point you made of we've done the display, but where's the good family practice? What did you mean by that?
Well, as I say, we find in empirical research, people want to do the best thing, and as defined socially. They want to look after their family, behave in a proper way, do the right thing. But that's an essential part of that is displaying to other people you're doing the right thing. So when my daughter was smaller, for instance, she fell down at school and banged her head. I knew she was all right, but everybody expected me to go to A&E and sit there for 5 hours, because I had to show people I was doing the right thing. Does that help you at all?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's perfect. So I think it's getting time to sort of wrap up. And what we'll do now is just do a brief round robin of all of the speakers. The one piece of advice which you would give Cass. Do you want to expand on that at all, Caroline?
Yeah, maybe Simon, you could stop sharing your screen because then we can see all the panelists again. And it would be nice if all the panelists could switch their videos on again so we can actually see them. they're coming. By the way, thank you so much, Simon, and sorry about the technical difficulties. That's always a bit stressful when that happens. So indeed, what we thought would be a good way to wrap up is to kind of ask you, from your research perspective, the one piece of advice you would give us as a community that is now going through this process and this struggle of what we should do. And maybe we can go in the same order in which we presented. So starting with Derek.
Thanks again, Caroline and Andre and Mark, for all the help. I've done too much talking, so I'm just going to say this. Your institution, like my institution here, is a place of privilege, a place of power, a place of wealth. And I'd encourage everyone to be very reparative and that very sort of loaded sense of that word as you go about figuring out what your new name should be, the new brand, the new symbolic identity marker. Thanks.
Marianne, yes.
Yes. I think my piece of advice would be to appreciate the power of the narrative, that it seems like there's a lot of strong feelings on all sides of this name change. And so conveying what is meant, why it is changing, how it is happening is going to be really critical, and not just simply doing it. Most of the firms in our sample did tell some story about their name change. So that was an important piece of it too.
And thank you, Marius.
Yeah, strong brands build communities. So communities are, the brand itself might be a community. The social aspect or the social settings that we have community character. So what we do in communities, similar to families that Simon has just mentioned, is we treat each other in that kind of generous, caring way. And that's something that I would recommend to ourselves, to make sure that we behave as a community, to make sure we cater to the interests of that broader community in a way that everyone feels included. Those who are anxious about losing a name, those who are basically waiting for the name to be abandoned, and find a solution that works collectively. I think that's the most important part for us, and make sure we know where our hearts are when we do that.
Yes, so on my side, I would say, I think pretty much I'm in line with what colleagues said. I think as an economist, I would like to say, look at, or get an estimate of where the strongest negative impact of that name was. Maybe it was in the community, maybe it has affected part of the community, part of the families, and try of positive actions. I don't know whether there can be some scholarships for, let's say, individuals from disadvantaged background and so on. But I think, some positive actions accompanied with this, I think, with a name change would make it, more valuable. That's what I think.
So I think Simon?
Can you hear me now? Oh, good. I'm so surprised. Well, I think first to my last point, really, and what it agrees with what several speakers have already implied or said more overtly. Change of name is a display of what you want to do. You've still got to find out to develop what the content is. What does changing name imply that you ought to do? It's more than perhaps having an equality and diversity committee.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for this. This is really good advice. Thankfully, this is recorded, so we will go through all of it again and take notes. I think the main message really is that that of course this will be quite a process that we are embarking on, and we're actually. It's a challenge, and that's what we're there for as a business school, right? We're there to actually look at the world, see what we can make better, and take on the challenge and solve it with all the tools and theories and knowledge that we have. And we really hope, and we're very thankful that all of you have taken the time. You've gotten up early in your part of the world. You have interrupted your holidays. So I think that that shows how important this topic actually is. We're really pleased that so many of you have joined as audience members. We've seen lots of students and alumni and members of staff who've joined this webinar. And we will obviously promise to keep you informed on everything. You will all have a big say in what we're doing next, and we look forward to tackling this challenge with all of you together. So thank you very much again, and have a wonderful summer. And for those of you who are food for thought addicts, we will see you again next week, Wednesday. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.